Alright, hi guys. Just kind of wanting to give you a video of the ending of our bias lesson with sample surveys. Just reminding you guys is that bias is when we over or underestimate the parameter that we're trying to find. And we talked about in class that bias could be there because of sampling error. So that means that something went wrong with the sample. And we went over the different types of sampling errors, but what I wanted to talk with you today is several types of non-sampling errors. Okay, so this means that we sampled great, but there's still bias getting in. Again, these notes are posted on the calendar, so if you want to print them out so that you'll have them, that would be great, or if you want to write them down later. Okay, so non-sampling errors, let me run through a couple. The first type is non-response. That's when you have sampled perfectly, but someone is not responding. Okay, they're refusing to participate. You just can't, like, you had a nice, perfect random sample, but you just can't get that person to either answer the phone or they just choose not to participate. So be careful not to confuse that with voluntary response. Voluntary response is when you put a general invitation to the survey out there and people choose to be a part of it. This is where you've sampled everything correctly, but you just can't get that person to participate. Okay, so that is non-response, and that could lead to bias because you're not getting that opinion of a certain group. Also, on the other hand, there is response bias, and that is when something about maybe what you're asking or the environment around the situation in which you're asking affects how people respond to your survey. So an example of that would be like the wording of the question. So maybe sometimes the wording of the question is confusing, or sometimes they are leading, meaning they're kind of maybe putting their opinion in there. So that would be wording of question. And even sometimes the order, like the example here, the order, like if you ask a college student, hey, how happy are you about your life in general? And then after that, ask, how many dates did you go on in the past month? If you switch that order and say, how many dates did you have in the last month? The answer to that question may affect how you answer the question, how happy are you about your life in general? So when you're making questions for surveys, it's really important that you avoid wording of the question. Really think about, is my question leading in any way? Is my, like someone would say, you know, I might walk up to somebody and say, hey, what do you think about blonde hair? Okay, well, I guess that's not a good question. That's not a good example. More like maybe if I was saying, hey, you know, 16-year-olds are really mature. And then I asked the question, do you feel like we should raise the voting age to 16? I guess lower the voting age to 16. That would be wording of the question. I gave my opinion in that. I said 16-year-olds are really mature. So that would be a problem with wording of the question. Another example of not wording of a question, but just response bias is sometimes the person that's asking affects the answer, and that's probably more about, like, if I say, hey, what do you think about blonde hair? Well, you may answer differently because I have blonde hair. You know, maybe you don't want to offend me or something like that. That actually, response bias was actually a big part of why Trump's election in 2016 was such a surprise. A lot of the polls that were done previously or before the election, people had a little bit of response bias. They were embarrassed or weren't willing to admit that they voted for Trump, so they weren't necessarily honest in their polls. Now, there are a lot of other reasons, and there is an article that I will share with you guys, but that is one part of that. So yeah, that's our vocabulary words for bias. I do have a few comments on that. It's very important that you know that there is some overlap between all of these vocabulary words, okay? Some of them can kind of apply to multiple situations. So my advice would be not to use these vocabulary words when you're writing responses to free response, okay? It is better for you just to describe it than to use one of these words and use it wrong, okay? You can totally get by with explaining the bias without using any of the words that I just gave you. So why did I give you these words to begin with? You will need to know them for the multiple choice portion. So you may see them on the multiple choice. So you need to know what they are. Same thing with probability notation. You guys were worried about using probability notation, and I told you, well, you can just use a complete sentence. That's fine. You don't have to, on the free response, use that probability notation. But they will use it on the multiple choice, so you need to know how to read it. You need to know which is the or symbol and which is the and symbol. Okay, same thing here. Okay, you don't have to use, and I strongly encourage you not to use any of the vocabulary words, just in case you don't quite get it right. It's better just to describe it. So that leads to the last bullet. Like, if you are asked to describe bias on the AP exam, there are two things you need to make sure that you write. Okay, so maybe jot these down, put this somewhere in your like an AP study guide or something like that to remind yourself. Maybe I need to make an acronym for this, I don't know. But if they ask you to talk about bias, you have to explain why that sample might be different from the whole population, like what went wrong, and then also the direction of the bias, meaning did this bias lead to an overestimate or an underestimate of what you were trying to find, okay? So I do want to show you a quick example of a question like about bias that has came up before, and you can see that it came up before in 2018, so just a few years ago. And I'm going to ignore part A. You're not quite ready for that, but we'll jump to part B. Let me explain what this question is about. It says that an environmental science teacher at a high school with a large population of students wants to estimate the proportion of students at the school who regularly recycle plastic bottles. So that's our parameter. She wants to know the proportion of students who recycle plastic bottles. The teacher selected a random sample of students at the school to survey. Each selected student went into the teacher's office one at a time and was asked to respond yes or no to the following question. Do you regularly recycle plastic bottles? So look at part B. It says, given the method used by the environmental science teacher to collect the responses, explain how bias might have been introduced and describe how the bias might affect the point estimate of the proportion of all students at school who would respond yes to the question. Okay, so you can see the two parts. They're kind of prompting you a little bit. Explain how bias might have been introduced. So we need to explain how the sample students might differ from the general population, and then it says, how does this bias affect the point estimate means like the parameter. That's another word for parameter. So explain how that bias might affect the parameter, or our, I guess, even our statistic. Like, what's going to be wrong with our statistic? What's going to be wrong with the proportion of all students at the school who would respond yes? Did this bias cause it to overestimate that proportion or underestimate that proportion? So you can maybe realize that if you're going to an environmental science teacher, that teacher probably went into that profession because they love the environment and want to preserve it. So if you were asked to go into the room with the teacher and she asks you, hey, do you regularly recycle plastic bottles? You might feel a little pressure to respond yes, because you may not want to feel judged, because you probably feel like you want to be on the same opinion of your environmental science teacher who probably regularly recycles plastic bottles. That's what I'm thinking is wrong with the situation. So technically that would be response bias, but again, let's just avoid using that term in our answer. So let me give you a model response to question B. So first thing, I need to explain how the bias might be different from the sampled students. So I might say the sampled student, the sampled student's responses will differ from opinions of, I guess, all students, the student body, because here's where we talk about where things went, like what went wrong, right? Where did the bias come from? And I would say because they may feel pressure to respond in favor of recycling because of fear of judgment from their teacher. Something along those lines. Sorry about my grammar. There we go. But now at this point, I would not get full credit because I've only answered the part about explain how bias might have been introduced. Okay? But remember, ATFQ, answer the question, answer the full question. So we have to address the second part. How might this bias, because of what's happening, how might this bias affect the proportion of students who would respond yes? So I would think that there's going to be a higher proportion of people saying that they are going to regularly recycle plastic bottles because of this pressure. So that's what I need to say. This will lead to an overestimate. So an overestimate of the, I'm just going to kind of repeat what the question says at this point. An overestimate of the proportion of all students at the school who would respond yes to the question. Done. There we go. We have answered part B of this 2018 question. Now, there was a part C and maybe even a part D, so I don't want you to think that this is all that a free response question would ask, but I did just want to specifically highlight this part B and how you would need to respond to it. All right, I hope this has been a helpful video for you, and I'll see you soon. Bye.